We're here today conducting an oral history with Lyle Larcheid. I'm the lead interviewer, Sam Larcheid.
I'm Rob Doro.
And Connor Lafferty is our cameraman. The date is November 27th of 2017. We'll be discussing his life. All right, what was your earliest memory?
Earliest memory was when I was when our family was moving from 23rd and Capitol Drive to 36th and Capitol Drive. I was a very young guy, and I was riding over in my uncle's Hupmobile, and I was in the rumble seat holding a little fish bowl. My pet was a little goldfish called Goldie.
And what were your memories of this house on 36th Street?
Well, those were my early days in grade school. I went to St. John de Nepomuk, and went all through 8 grades there, and it was a great experience. We had a lot of young kids at my age in the neighborhood, so it was while I was an only child, there were a lot of kids to play with. So
yeah, like what were your, I don't know, what would you say is your recollection of like the neighborhood like?
It was very open and free. You didn't worry about the things that the people today have to worry about. You had a time to be in at night, and you could play all day. And if you got home in time, it was no problem. And you never worried about the things that unfortunately the parents today have to worry about with their kids outside.
Yeah, and like the neighborhood, like was there a predominant like ethnic group? No,
it was all mixed neighborhood. Predominantly white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how long did you live in that house?
Until 1941, from 28 or so, 1929 I think it was, till 1941.
Yeah. And so going back to grade school,
Mm-hmm.
what were your memories of that?
Had a great school experience there. St. John de Nepomuk was a little bohemian parish and had a 4-classroom school where the Notre Dame nuns taught us. And I remember my first grade teacher was just a sweet young lady that took care of me. As a matter of fact, I spent 2 years in first grade. I got there a little early, and she thought that I would be better suited to move on if I spent 2 years in first grade. After that, it was a very good experience. I was eventually moved on, and up in the 8th grade, I was the class president. We put on a show at WTMJ one time, and I was also very active in the Boy Scouts as I got older there.
Yeah, so talking about Boy Scouts, like how did you really get into Boy Scouts?
Well, our parish didn't have a troop, so about 5 of us formed what was called the Beaver Patrol of Troop 99 at St. Catherine's Church up on 51st and Center. And we just had a great time. I was fortunate to have a scoutmaster who had a couple sons in the Boy Scouts, and he was just probably the epitome of a great scoutmaster. So my experience with the Boy Scouts was great. I went all through the ranks, became an Eagle Scout, and was very active in camping and camp work. I spent one summer up in the North Woods at a canoe base. I spent 2 or 3 summers at Indian Mound Reservation, the Boy Scout camp out in Oconomowoc on Silver Lake. I was assistant waterfront director there, and in that process got involved with a lot of water experiences. Built my own sailing canoe rig, and ultimately won several canoe races for the American Canoe Association down in Chicago and in Lake Geneva and a number of other places. I was also very active at the camping at Indian Mound with the Order of the Arrow, which is a kind of an camping honor society for the Boy Scouts. I became a Vigil Honor member of the Order of the Arrow, and was also the Chief Alawat Sakima for the ritual deal. Each week, a group of camp boys were selected to be taken into the Order of the Arrow, and part of my job was to do the ritual part of it. So it was very, very interesting and a lot of fun. Even today, I am a member of the Order of the Arrow, and I get emails from the Order of the Arrow 60 years later.
All right, so what really propelled you to want to become an Eagle Scout, go through all the ranks and everything?
It was an exhilarating experience. It was all the things that Scouts do were interesting to me, and so it wasn't a chore. It was a labor of love. As a matter of fact, I was so interested in the Boy Scouts and the long-term deal that eventually I almost became a Scout executive. When I went through college, well, first of all, let's go back a little bit. I went through Marquette High, finished and graduated in 1947. Then the next 2 years I spent at Marquette University in the Business Administration School. During that time, an organization was formed by the mayor of Kansas City, a great big bombastic gentleman called H. Roe Bartle. He was the mayor of Kansas City, and he formed what was called the American Humanics Society. And their first classes were set up at a little college down in Marshall, Missouri, and the Scout executive in Milwaukee talked me into going down there and taking those courses. So in 50 and 51, I was at Missouri Valley College and was anticipated going into the Scout executive field. I graduated in June of 51 and was drafted in August. So from there I went on into the service. Do you want me to go into that now?
No, we'll touch
go
back
back
on that later.
Okay.
So talking about your childhood homes,
okay.
So your mother and father lived with you. What did your father do?
My father owned a little grocery store on First and Reservoir in the Brewer Hill area. That was before the advent of supermarkets and what have you, and so he had a little gold mine. He was the only store in that whole area, and just did a phenomenal job. But my dad was a very hard-working guy. In the early days, he'd have to get up at 4 in the morning to go to the market and pick up the vegetables and all that kind of stuff, fruits and whatever, and he'd work until 6 at night, and he was even open on Sunday for a while from 9 to noon, and that finally he got rid of that. But he was basically a butcher, and ran the grocery store. The store had a little warehouse behind it, which at the time he bought it had a little bit of a problem. This was the time for Prohibition in the early 30s, and when my dad bought the store and the warehouse and whatever, he didn't realize that there was a guy running a still in the back of the grocery store in the warehouse. So he had a little bit of a problem with that, got rid of that and whatever. But the store just did very well for him. He owned he was able to buy a number of real estate properties, 2 or 3 duplexes, and eventually the store was the property on that side of the city block was all bought out by the city of Milwaukee to expand the Palmer Street School. So he was fortunate in that as the market changed and Kohl's came in with their big supermarkets and all, business was slowing down and so forth. So the city of Milwaukee bought him out at a very respectable price, and so he was able to kind of semi-retire. And from there on, he went to work for other butcher shops and stuff out here. So
like, what are some of your best memories from the market?
Oh, early on, I would go down there on Saturdays, and take the Capitol Drive bus to Holton and Holton down, and I'd walk across from either Holton or from 3rd Street to the store, and I would sit behind the penny candy counter and sell penny candies. That was my job initially. And as time went on, I became more adept at some of the things. I was able to, at the time, chickens would come in and they had all the insides in. So I learned how to eviscerate a chicken, take the stuffings out and get it all set up. I also was able to skin a calf. A whole calf would come in and be hung up on a big rack. And my dad taught me how to skin a calf. So those were some of the experiences I had there.
Well, so like later on in life, were you still like involved in the supermarket, or you
No. My dad never made an issue that I should follow in his footsteps at the supermarket. So he may have been a little disappointed, but actually, as things worked out, he, as I said, he was able to get out of it as the whole neighborhood changed and whatever. Initially, it was a neighborhood of brewery families, big families that worked down in Schlitz and Pabst and Blatz.
In Brewers Hill.
In Brewers Hill, yeah. So.
Yeah, so you attended St. John de Nepewalk for
9 years actually.
But for like mass and worship as well?
Yes, very much, definitely. As a matter of fact, I was an altar boy, acolyte for a long time, and that was when Mass was said in Latin, and the responses from the altar boys was in Latin also. I don't remember much of it anymore.
Do you have any good memories from that?
Yes, very much so. The original pastor was Father Buznik. He was a little roly-poly bohemian guy, and every time he saw you, he'd come up and he'd pinch your cheek and tell you you'd be a good boy and stuff. He was a cute old guy. So.
All right, so then after grade school, you went to MUHS, right?
Yes, Marquette High.
And what were your like opinions going into that? Like, what did you think it would be all about?
Well, I didn't really know initially. I was really kind of special that I was able to get in at the time, and I was never a super student. I was a CB student over the years and stuff. But I remember Father Foley was the principal, and Father Lubke was the disciplinarian, and he was a real character, and. It was a great experience. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because myself and another young guy were the school photographers, kind of like you guys are doing now.
Yeah.
Only that was when we were using film and developing it down in the basement, and behind a stairway there was kind of a dark room down there.
Yeah, do you have like good memories from doing photography?
Absolute wonderful memories. Made a lot of friends, long-term friends, guys that even today that I talk with once in a while. So,
what would you say were some of like the best things that you shot while being a photographer at Marquette?
Oh gosh,
The good events.
Any
favorites?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't have anything special that way. It was just an overall good experience.
So were you involved in anything else at Marquette?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the yearbook to remember the different societies and stuff that I was there.
So were you still very active in Boy Scouts during this time?
Yes, very much so.
Where were you at this time when you were in high school, in the Boy Scouts?
I was an Eagle Scout, and I was in the summers I would be on the waterfront crew, teaching swimming and sailing and canoeing and stuff.
Okay, then, so kind of switching gears here to the draft. Did that happen after high school or after college?
After college.
After college.
Yeah.
All right, so then we'll go to college then. So you attended Marquette University.
Yes.
For business administration.
Right.
Was that your? Did you want to go into business administration? Was that?
Yeah, at the time it was what I thought I wanted to get into, but I didn't do that well at some of the courses, and so when the opportunity came up to be able to go out to Missouri Valley and take the humanics courses, which it's a college, it's a regular school. I took the opportunity, and I was happy I did. It was a great experience. A lot of psychology, sociology, and that kind of stuff.
So when you attended college at Missouri Valley, what were some of your good memories there?
Well, I was a school photographer there too. I hitched up with a studio in the downtown area of downtown. It's a little bitty town, but it's one of those towns that has a square, and on the square was a photographer called Gilkey's Photography. And so he and I hit it off, and so he would do all my processing for all the school, and there I did a lot of school work, sports work and the social events and stuff too.
Yeah. So you were still involved in the Boy Scouts in college as well?
Well, not necessarily. Because of the humanics courses, yes. But not directly with the Boy Scouts as such.
All right. So then can you kind of like explain what a Scout executive would do with the position?
Basically, a Scout executive is a fundraiser and a kind of an organizer. And I mean, after I got all through with school, I realized that I had a different idea of what a Scout executive would do because of my experiences at camp in the summer. Those guys were having a ball as the directors of the camp. But basically, a Scout executive is an organizer and a fundraiser type, and so that lost a little shine after I was finished.
So then, after college, like, where were you kind of at? Like, did you still want to go be a Scout executive, or did you pursue?
No, I spent 2.5 years in the service, and when I got out, I just decided that I didn't want to be a Scout executive as such, and so.
So talking about your service, when were you drafted?
August of 1951.
And how long after college was that?
A couple months.
Couple months?
I had been deferred to finish college, so I had been drafted earlier, but they gave me a deferment to finish college.
So what was your experience with the draft?
Well, I was drafted with a bunch of guys. As a matter of fact, a couple of them were from Marquette High, were classmates of mine when we were all drafted together. And from here, Milwaukee, we were sent to Fort Meade, Maryland for basic training, and we were in the Medical Service Corps. We were going to be medics, frontline medics. Went through basic training at Fort Meade, Maryland, right outside of Washington. Had a number of interesting experiences there. After we were there for a while, we would get weekend passes, and one weekend pass I was able to go to New York City, and a couple of us were able to get into the original Guys and Dolls Broadway show. We had standing room only, but I don't know if you remember that or not, but Guys and Dolls was a big show, and it's come back a number of times. And what amazed me at the time was how small the Broadway theaters were. We had standing room, but we were like, I could almost reach out and touch them, it seemed. And the other experience I had was a weekend pass down to Williamsburg, Virginia. Williamsburg is the area that has been rebuilt by the Rockefellers and whatever, and it has the original Capitol building where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," sort of thing. And my experience there was I was able to get a room in the house that was right next door to the Capitol building, and in a kind of it was an ancient place, but it had a huge feather bed, which I was alone in that trip. The other thing is I had dinner at what was called the King's Arms Inn, and I was there by myself, eating dinner, and it was a rainy day, and when I got up to leave, this couple that was sitting next to us ended up paying for my dinner and whatever, because I was kind of a dreary-looking foot soldier standing there. So anyway, that's that for that. But during that period of time, when you were finished with basic, they asked if anybody was interested in going to officer candidate school. Well, I was aware that the guys that were going from our unit right over to Korea just had a big red cross on their back and were not having a good time at the time. So when they asked if you could wanted to go to officer candidates, I raised my hand and I was accepted. What was interesting is my eyes aren't that great. So the day of the eye examination for the acceptance to go into officer school was the day of a crucial game in the World Series, baseball. And so when I got up to sit down and do the eye chart, the doctor said, "Can you see the eye chart?" I said, "Oh, hell yes, I can see the eye chart." Said, "Fine," boom, and I got in. The guy right behind me was a guy by the name of Bob Herzog. His dad was a big sports writer in Milwaukee, and Bob also ended up being a sports announcer and stuff in Milwaukee. Goes back a little further, but the name was pretty well known in Milwaukee at the time. So he was a buddy of mine in the basic. He didn't make it and was pretty upset about it. So from there, I went out to Fort Riley, Kansas, and spent the next number of months at officer candidate school, which was a tough road to hoe. The number of people that started was like close to 900 people guys were started initially, and they ended up with about 250, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the 250. So I became a second lieutenant.
So officer candidate school, what really did that entail? Like, what was the purpose?
To train you to be an officer in the United States Army, and all the things that go with it, the whatever. It was interesting because I got there in a blizzard, and when I left, it was 100 degrees in Kansas in the summertime. It was really hot. And every place you went, you double timed, and you had what was called an M1 rifle, which is a heavy old rifle. They don't use those kind. It's now an M14 or 16 or whatever. But and every place you went, you were double timed. You didn't march any place. It was all okay. Forward, double time, march, boom, away you went. I lost probably 30 or 40 pounds during that stay. I came home. My mother thought I'd been in the hospital because I was so thin and trim. It was a good experience. I enjoyed it a lot.
So was the work very strenuous?
Yes.
What were some of the things you had to do?
Well, you went through these various obstacle courses, and I was amazed at how much, after a while, you built your muscles up. What I could accomplish and do, making the obstacle courses was a kind of a fun thing in the end. So.
Yeah. So then
and marching. There was a lot of marching and whatever, and I enjoyed that a lot. It was a good experience.
So then after officer candidate school at Fort Riley, where did you go after that?
To Fort Sam Houston, Texas, for advanced medical service work. Down at Fort Sam in San Antonio, you learned how to set up battalion aid stations and what the physical setting up of things and more advanced training in that. So from Fort Sam Houston, then I was assigned to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana was a holding company waiting for orders to go overseas. So in our little group, there were 13 second lieutenants and 1 major and 1 sergeant major. During that stay at Camp Atterbury, the major who I got to know pretty well was moving into town, and I helped him move and whatever. So one day he came to me and he said, "Hey, Larcheid, I've got an opening at Fort Sheridan for a mess administration course. Would you be interested?" I said, "Oh, heck yes. Fort Sheridan, I can go home," and went back and forth. So as it turned out, I went through a mess administration course at Fort Sheridan, which started out being a full Army cook course, then into the administration part of it, which is ordering food and doing all the paperwork and so forth. So that kind of stood me in good stead later on. So should I go on?
Go ahead.
So from there, then from Camp Atterbury, I got orders to fly I flew from Milwaukee to Vancouver, and in Vancouver, we were loaded onto a chartered Canadian Pacific airliner with civilian staff. It was the latest DC-6, which was the last of the propeller-driven airplanes to fly across the oceans and stuff. It was an interesting flight. It's a good flight. We flew from Vancouver to a little rock island in the Aleutian chain called Shimya. It was a refueling station for all these transatlantic or trans-Pacific flights. And it was interesting because as you came in, you couldn't see the island. As it was daytime, you couldn't see the island. And as we finally landed, and the airplane went all the way to the end of the runway, and the wing went out over the water and came back. And there was just a small crew of people that were refueling the plane. So from Shimya, we flew to Tokyo and spent some time in Tokyo. We were put up in the Tokyo, the equivalent of Tokyo's West Point. And it was interesting because I was 6'2", and most of the guys were pretty tall guys. And everything was small, short. All the doors, you had a duct to go through and the whole thing. So that was kind of an interesting experience. So from there, we were trucked down to a seaport, and I forget which one, got on a troop ship and went from Japan to Incheon, Korea. Incheon is a port right outside of Seoul. At Incheon, we were put on a train and went from Incheon into Seoul. And in Seoul, it was kind of interesting because I had no idea what was going to happen, but the first thing they do is said, "Well, you've got to go downtown and decide where you want to go." I said, "What do you mean you decide where you want to go?" "Well, you want to go on the front line with the 3rd Division, or do you want to, which is due to come back off for R&R, or do you want to go in the 2nd Division, which is behind the line but it's going to go up?" I said, "I don't care." So I'm sitting on my duffel bag waiting for the Jeep to take me up to the 3rd Division. At that point in time, a young guy walks up to me, and it turns out to be my cousin from Illinois, Roger LaPlante. Just a really freaky thing to see. All of a sudden, he's there and I'm there, whatever. Well, I was about to get on into the Jeep and go back downtown, where they interview you and kind of go through that little routine. And he said, "Hey, Lieutenant Larcheid, you can't go yet. You gotta go back downtown." I thought, God, I've only been here a couple of days. What? I didn't do any. Whatever happened? So I go back downtown, and the major down there says, "We see on your listing of things that you've done that you went through a mess administration course. We need a mess administration officer at the 11th Evac Hospital in Wonju." Now, Wonju is about 130 miles from, maybe 120 miles from Seoul. So he said, "Would you be interested?" I thought, heck yes. Rather than going up and be shot at on the front lines, I'll take that. So I did. Hopped on a DC-3 and flew down to Wonju, which is where the 11th Evac was. The fighting was still going on heavily at that time. As a matter of fact, we could hear the artillery and stuff going off all the time. As the fighting progressed and went north of us, it became a little quieter. But our unit was then, it It was acting as a MASH unit. I mean, a lot of people have watched the movie MASH, which is a overplay, but not that much. The basic doctors were good doctors, but they didn't have any military bearing. And we were all these fresh, I mean, there were 2 or 3 of us, second lieutenants, that were, you know, kind of spit and polish at that point yet. My job there was mess officer, PX officer, pharmacy officer, training officer, and USO troop officer. I mean, all these different jobs. Because the USO troops would come in, they'd fly in, and we'd bring them up in a bus and put on a show for us and stuff. So I don't know how much more you want me to go into there.
Oh yeah, keep going.
Well, the 11th Evac Hospital was unique in that a colonel, I forget his name right now, but there was a colonel that was involved with the artificial kidneys, and he was noticing, he was in our unit, he was noticing that there was an awful lot of renal problems, kidney problems and stuff, and they weren't able to take care of them. But at the time, there was a new kidney dialysis machine that was available in the States. He went to his superiors, and they said, "No, you can't bring it over." He turned around and disobeyed orders and cut some orders and brought the kidney over to the 11th Evac Hospital and saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. As it turned out, the colonel disobeyed orders. He was slated to become the Surgeon General, but was dismissed because he did something he shouldn't have done, but he saved hundreds of lives. They were flying in patients from all over the Far East out there to go through that renal thing. And the kidney was a huge machine. Today they're totally different. It was a great big drum that the blood went through. So anyway, that was an interesting part of it. The other interesting part of it, every GI that was killed in Korea had a autopsy performed. That was interesting to go down to that particular tent and see what went on there. Other than that, it was a great experience. We had a Catholic priest, an Irish Catholic priest, as our chaplain, and on one occasion, he had a deal going on in Seoul that he asked me to go up with him to, and so I did. I went up to Seoul with the padre, and we were put up in an Irish monastery in Seoul. That night, Bedcheck Charlie came by. You may have heard that if you watch MASH at all. It's an old airplane that they dropped a 100-pound bomb from, and it would buzz over the top. Well, that night he dropped a bomb right outside our complex and killed a couple Boston reporters for a Catholic magazine in Boston. That was the closest I got to being really hurt in Korea. So then after that, the truce was signed, and our unit, the 11th Evac unit, was chosen to be the processing unit when they decided to exchange prisoners with the North Koreans and Chinese. So our unit was then moved up to Munsa-ni, which is north of Seoul and just south of Panmunjom. They literally leveled a mountain for a helicopter pad and built this huge complex there where the prisoners of war were trucked down to from Panmunjom, where they were exchanged, and came down in ambulances and went through a whole process there. The process started out, they were interrogated, then they were measured for custom uniforms that were made, were cut for them and sewn for them while they were going through their physical, their medical physical. And they a number of things. And then at the end of that little ritual, before they went through the medical exam, they all had the opportunity to take a shower, a hot shower, for as long as they wanted. And that's where they would get rid of all their old uniforms and some of the stuff that they had been given to take back to the States. And that some of the stuff I showed you earlier here, the little thingies that the North Koreans and the Chinese. Another interesting spot was that our guys came down in pajamas. They were kind of a pajama uniform. We, in turn, had given all the North Koreans and the Chinese that were being repatriated full military uniforms, leather boots. And they were brought up to the Panmunjom area on a train. The train went past right close to where we were situated. And what was happening, these Chinese and North Koreans were throwing the boots out of the train and going up with just bottoms on, no shirts and stuff. And we just thought that was the most ridiculous thing to see. These guys had never seen a leather boot, I mean, like we were giving them. Anyway, that was that. Then one day I was able to hop a Jeep and go up to Panmunjom where the exchange was taking place. As I got there, the Russian Jeeps were coming up with the prisoners, and lo and behold, here comes General Dean, the only American general ever captured, and he was being repatriated. I happened to hit the day that he was coming down, so I took a bunch of slides of him in the Russian Jeep and getting into our unit and whatever, and then coming back down to what was called Freedom Village, where he was processed, along with about 300 and some other prisoners, 400, I guess, I forget the exact number. So when that was all done and the exchange was completed, we went back to our original unit, and it was the truce is signed, so if you wanted to, you could apply to go home, which I did. At one point in time, a chief warrant officer joined. My buddy and I had our own tent, and this Fred Portman was his name, was the personal secretary for General Mark Clark, who was a big shot in the Far East at the time. And he offered both of us what was called a regular Army commission. That, you get one of those when you come out of West Point, but other than that, they're pretty hard to come by. We both decided we were going to stay in the reserve and get out of the Army, period. So, but that was an opportunity that not many people would have had. So, got mustered out, went from Seoul rather down to Busan on the far south tip of Korea, and got on a big troop ship. We no more than got out of the harbor and we were into a typhoon. And this was not a small ship, but it was bouncing to the point where the propeller would come out of the water and would just whir, and actually we bent, the propeller shaft got bent. So it took 3 or 4 extra days because they couldn't go as fast as they wanted to. Got home in San Francisco, took a train home, and that was the end of my military service.
So that was your first experience outside the U.S.? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, and then the whole time you were there, were you taking pictures?
Yes, hundreds of slides.
Okay, so then during the war, what was going on at home, and were you still in touch with people back?
Oh yeah, I was talking. I mean, my mother wrote me a letter every other day, and I'd write back about once a week. At the time, I didn't have a steady girl. I was kind of corresponding with my future wife, but she wasn't a very good letter writer, and so we didn't do much there for a long time.
So when did you meet her?
When I got home, it's kind of funny because it's an odd story. She invited me when she was going to Holy Angels at the time. She invited me to their prom, Holy Angels prom, and I went and had a great time. But then I didn't see her for a long, long time.
Was that before the war?
That was when I was at Marquette High.
Oh.
And I didn't see her until 4 years of college and 2.5 years of service. And then one day I was visiting my cousins. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so I had a couple cousins that lived in Milwaukee and I was real close to. And the one girl was a good friend of Joanne's, my wife. And so they invited me over one night, and all of a sudden I was kind of smitten with this girl that I had seen way back when, but never did anything. So anyway, we hit it off and went from there with it. So
yeah. So changing gears here, when you came back, did you live with your parents still, or?
Yeah, initially I did for a while, for a year. I lived with them.
And what were you doing then? Like,
well, when I got home in December, got home for Christmas, and over Christmas I visited a good buddy of mine, a real close guy, Dick Pilon, who we had been close friends at Marquette High as well. And his sister was a pretty cute gal, so I went over and visited with them, and their dad, Urban Pilon, cornered me and he said, "What are you going to do now that you're home?" I said, "I really don't have any fixed job or anything to look at." He said, "Well, January 3rd, why don't you come and see me?" So on January 3rd, I went to First Milwaukee Savings and Loan. He offered me a job, and I accepted. That was January of 1954. And from there on, we're into my career as a savings and loan officer.
Yeah. So, what was your experience as a savings and loan officer?
Well, my first part was just a plain old loan clerk and whatever. Our office was in the Brumner Building, which is now called the Germania Building. And I started developing interests in all kinds of stuff. Appraisals, and of course real estate was a big part of it. And so as time went on, I became interested and involved in the appraisal area. I eventually earned a certified residential appraisal certificate. And as it turns out, I ended up being the president of the Society of Real Estate Appraisers at one point in time. I was also involved with the realtors. I was a real estate broker for 40 years. Only sold a couple places which were my own properties. But I was also vice president. I was treasurer of the Milwaukee Board of Realtors for 3 or 4 years, and was very active with the real estate area and also with the appraisal area.
So earlier you said that you switched buildings and kind of grew as time went on.
Yes.
Kind of explain.
Well, we were in the Brumner Building and outgrew that. So across the street was the Business Institute building, which is now gone. It's a parking lot for one of the bars down there now. But we had the first floor. And it was a decent, nice size office, and it was kind of interesting because there was a little back door entrance, and one went into a back hall, and one side in the back hall was the Heinemann restaurant, so we could go right into the Heinemann's restaurant, and the other door was into a steakhouse. I can't think of his name now. It was a steakhouse anyway. So. That was always kind of interesting. I had a couple of interesting experiences there. One day, a guy came in and was falsifying some papers and what have you, and we didn't know what to do at the time. So when he walked out and went down Plankington Avenue towards Wisconsin Avenue, and I hightailed it out after him. We got down to the corner of Wisconsin Avenue and Plankington, right by the Riverside Theater, and that was when there was a policeman on the corner, all the corners, and I knew the local police guys real well, and I said, "There's a guy that has gotten away with something from First Milwaukee down the block," and he said, "Oh, okay." So all of a sudden, this guy comes running out. It was a Walgreens store on the corner, and he comes running down. He's running across the bridge on the river, and he gets tackled by what was an FBI agent just going by. The policeman was yelling at him, and so anyway, they caught that guy. Over a period of time, I went from assistant vice president or treasurer to this to that. I ended up as the president of First Milwaukee Savings and Loan, and I think it was 80. It's on some of those papers, I forget the exact date. But I was the president of First Milwaukee Savings for quite a while. That was an interesting experience. As time went on, the financial industry, the savings and loan industry particularly, went into some hard times in the early 1980s. And so I had an excellent board of directors. We looked at who we were, what we were up against, and so forth. We decided that a merger would make some sense. So at the time we merged, we worked out a merger with St. Francis Savings and Loan down on Kinnickinnick Avenue down on the south side. So from First Milwaukee, I went to being senior executive vice president of St. Francis. I was there for 5 years. During my stint there, we did a lot of financing across the country. And so I got to travel to projects in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'd go down there at least once a month. We had projects in San Francisco, Riverside, California, and some other places. So I got to travel a lot in that, inspecting and following through on those projects. Then at one point in time, because I'd been so active in the savings and loan business, the Perry brothers, who ran Wauwatosa Savings at the time, called me one day and said, we'd like to have lunch. So we went and had lunch, and they literally made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I joined Wauwatosa Savings and was there for the last 22 years of my business career as senior executive vice president running the mortgage loan department at Wauwatosa Savings. I retired from there in September of 2010.
Okay, so
10. Yeah.
When we talked earlier, you said you financed the restoration of the Pabst Mansion.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there was a big to-do. There was a group that formed, and there were a lot of these big old mansions that were being torn down, and it was just a shame to see them go. So this one organization decided to try to do something about it, and we formed a little coalition of about 4 or 5 savings and loans, and we decided we would finance the restoration of the Pabst Mansion. So I was part of that deal.
Okay, so we're gonna take a little break now.
All right, sounds good.
Come back after the break, and then we'll finish everything up. So.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
All right, so after the war, where did you live?
Initially, I lived with my folks for a year until I got married. In the meantime, I had bought a duplex on 54th Street, 2950 known as 54th Street. So we moved in, when we got married, we moved in there initially. And we started having our family there.
What were your memories of that house?
It was a neat first floor duplex that the previous owner had remodeled and upgraded considerably. So it was nice. I built a dark room in the basement because at that time I was doing candid weddings. I was still in the photography end of things. I probably did a dozen or maybe 15 or so weddings, a full wedding with the albums and the whole shot. And I processed that all myself in my little dark room down in the basement.
So were you just shooting weddings, or were you just taking pictures for fun as well? Or?
Oh yeah, taking pictures for fun as well, sure.
All right, then what was your memories of the neighborhood with the duplex?
It was a neat neighborhood. We developed a number of friends that lived close by, and friends that we kept for a long time after we moved out of there. So.
And did you have any children at this house?
Yes, we had first 2 boys, Dan and Bill were born there. Mary Kay was born after we moved out of there. From there, being in the business, in the finance business and the savings and loan, I had an opportunity to know when various builders were having problems and whatever. And it turns out that a gentleman at Surety Savings and Loan, which is no longer around, had foreclosed on a number of homes in Brookfield that were under construction and just finished construction. So there was this nice brick ranch out on Country Lane in Brookfield, just south of Capitol and west of Calhoun Road, that I fell in love with. I went to, Joe Schisler was the president of the Savings and Loan, and I said, Joe, I'd like to make an offer on that place. He said, and I told him a number, and he said, oh, get out of here, you young punk. Anyway, I said, Joe, you've got this place, it's winter coming on, you're gonna have to heat it and all the rest of it. Long story short, he ended up selling me that home out there. 17920 West Country Lane. We were there for a number of years. Mary Kay was born, my daughter was born there. My next two sons were born there. After a number of years in that house, the land adjacent to our subdivision was a farmer's field, and it was developed into a subdivision called Dominic Heights. It backed onto St. Dominic's Church and ended up backing onto the subdivision that we were living in. I ended up buying a lot there, and initially, and then built a house, a very lovely home, a pretty decent size home there, and that's where we raised all 5 of our kids, basically. We didn't go into the house on 54th Street though. That I lived in from 41 till 55.
Did you still rent it out?
No.
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 Okay.
The house on 51st Street was built in 1941 by my dad. It was in that block on 51st and Melvina and Vienna was the only there was 2 houses in the whole city block. This was all virgin country in 1941. There weren't any homes other than our home and whatever. So that was what was unique about that is my dad had 2 huge safes, 4 by 5 safes, big heavy steel safes. He didn't know what to do with them. He couldn't get rid of them. So he ended up having a trucker truck the safe from the store and put it in the excavation hole. That safe is still in that house. It's never going to go anyplace.
Which house is it?
This is 52nd Street.
And this was your third?
Yeah. Yes, third house. 52nd Street was where I spent all my boyhood, Boy Scout days and all that kind of stuff in there. Okay, and Marquette High days.
Yeah, so back to the house in Brookfield. Was that a big transition moving from 54th to Brookfield? Yeah,
it was different. And it ended up, it was a beautiful house, had a great basement and area for the kids to play in. It was a corner lot, didn't have a big backyard, but that didn't stop anyone from having fun out there. So, go. What's next?
What were some of your best memories in the house?
Of that house?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the fact that I landscaped the whole thing, and a little sidelight is when we first bought it, it needed a lot of fill, and so in the process of filling, it was a drilled well situation at that time before the city water came in, and I had to have a casing, an extension put on the well casing. So I called the well driller, and he came over, and it was interesting because he was standing around and he said, you know, it's kind of interesting. I'm looking around. He said, I used to hunt ducks right where your house is. Well, it turns out that there was a pond at one time there, and it was a spring-fed pond, because after we moved in, the sump pump ran every day, not all day long, but every so often the sump pump would go on, and it would pump the water out to the street. And what was interesting, because it became so ingrained in my brain, that one night it didn't go on, and I woke up and I said, something isn't right. Well, it turned out it was flooding in the basement. So I had a standby sump pump, threw it in, and things worked out. But other than that, it was a great house. But when we had 5 kids and 3 bedrooms and 4 boys, it didn't work out. So when we were able to buy the lot and build the end house, so to speak, which we lived in for 47 years after that, on Dominic Drive.
Yeah, so moving to Dominic Drive, kind of, what was your experience with that?
Well, I had, in the business, I had developed some relationships with some very good builders. And there was a guy by the name of Paul Bobrowitz, was a Brookfield resident for his life and whatever, and he was a builder, and he was a custom builder. So he and I literally, I designed the house, and he and I built it. It was a really well-built home. It had 4 big bedrooms, big living room, family room. Ended up eventually with a 20 by 40 in-ground swimming pool in the backyard. It was a beautiful place.
And were there like a lot of other people in the neighborhood? Like, seeing as though it's a pretty new neighborhood?
Initially, we were the 3rd house in the subdivision. And then, of course, it filled up and whatever. Because our kids used to play, there was kind of a low area and a little creek that ran back there, and they all had fun going and putting rafts and stuff in and whatever. But they all grew up there. Initially, before we had the pool, every winter we would flood the backyard with and make an ice rink out of it. So,
what are some of your other memories from that house?
Oh, over a period of time, I had a guy come in and finish off the basement. So the basement was totally finished off. It had a bar that was probably 12 feet long, 10 to 12 feet long. And a good friend of mine was in the copper business. And so he gave me a sheet of copper, which I put on the top of the bar. And then I had my ad agency do a design, and we had a design, a kind of a fleur-de-lis and whatever design on the whole top of the bar, and I hand pounded 1,000 brass nails into that. And when that was all done, it was beautiful. I polished it and then put a coating of epoxy on. So the bar is an outstanding bar. It was one of the selling points when I went to go to sell the house. The guy couldn't get over the bar and the whole thing. It was really so. We had a pool table down there in one area. We had another big area that had a ping pong table, cabinets, and the pool equipment was down in the basement, which always was a concern that if something would blow, I could flood the basement with the pool, but never happened to me. I think it happened to the guy that bought my house afterwards, because something happened with him, but I don't know all what. But so that house was just a phenomenal house to have grown up kids in.
Yeah. So did you have the neighbors over a lot?
Yeah. Yeah. I had neighbors over all the time, swimming and whatever. My daughter, Mary Kay, had some problems with knees and stuff, and so the pool was a great boon for her. But I kept the pool between 89 and 91 degrees all the time, which was the biggest hot tub. They always kidded me because I had the biggest hot tub in Brookfield. But everybody used it all the time because it wasn't, the next door neighbor had a pool, and he never heated it, and it was always cold, and they never didn't want to go in. So it worked out well that way.
Yeah. So where were you attending for Mass?
Right 5 houses down with St. Dominic's Church. We started St. Dominic's 1 year after St. Dominic's moved to Capitol Drive. So we're just about founding fathers of St. Dominic's. Father Grohol, it was interesting because Father Grohol, the original pastor, was an assistant at St. Agnes, where Joanne, my wife, went to school and grew up. And I used to go to the CYO dances at St. Agnes all the time and got to know Father Grohol. So when we moved out there, we knew him pretty well. He'd come over to the house regularly and whatever. So, and then from there on, we were active in the parish the whole time.
Yeah. So what was Father Grohol like?
Father Grohol was an interesting character, I guess we could say, because he either loved him or hated him. He was a kind of a gruff guy, biggest heart in the world, but a fun guy. He just he'd rub some people wrong, but if you just took him the right way, you had a lot of fun with him, and a great person.
Yeah. So at this time, what was going on with your children?
Well, they were all going through St. Dominic's, all eight grades. Mary Kay was the one having the problem. She's the one that had the knee problems, and unfortunately, one of the doctors removed all of her kneecaps, and that has been a real problem for her over the years. Rest of them, the boys, all did well, are doing well, so I guess I can't complain.
Yeah. So did you have any like memorable family vacations?
Oh yes, we had a lot of family vacations. Initially, way back when, we had just moved to Country Lane, and a friend of mine, a builder of mine, had bought a camping trailer business. And having been an old Boy Scout and camping a lot, I was kind of anxious to see if we could get into that. So one October weekend, I called him, and he had a pop-up trailer that I could use. So I had a hitch put on the back of my car, went and got the pop-up trailer, and we took off on early Friday evening to head west. We didn't know where we were going to go or what have you. Well, it turned out we got to Madison, and the park that we were going to camp at had been closed. So we're driving around, pulling this trailer, 5 kids in the station wagon, and we pull into this one little area on the west side of Mendota in Madison. And I hear this music and stuff playing at this house. So I got out and walked up to this guy, and I said, I got a problem. I said, we were going to camp at this park. And oh yeah, well, I could tell he was having a nice weekend. He was very happy. He said, think no more, stop no more. He said, I'll take you there. I know the sheriff. So he hopped in his MG, a little MG, and he took off like a bat. And I'm here trying to follow him over to the park. So we got to the park. We set up the tent, the first time we've ever done this in the dark. Nobody ever bothered, and he made sure that he said the police won't bother you at all. And turns out he was a geology professor from the University of Wisconsin, loved camping, and wanted to see the kids have an experience. So we had a great experience. We woke up in the morning, and here we were right next to a pasture with a bunch of cows, and beautiful, beautiful day. We went from there, we went on to Wyalusing State Park on the Mississippi, had a great weekend, came home and decided we were going to do some more camping. From that point on, I had to deal with this camping guy. I'd buy a trailer in the spring, use it all summer, and then return it to him in the fall and buy a new one the next year. Because as it turned out, every time I gave it back to him, it was in better shape than when he'd got it. I'd gotten all the bugs out of it. So we had a deal. We went from a 17-foot Shasta to a 22-foot Shasta, and we traveled the country. We went down to Florida. We pulled it down to Florida. We pulled it on vacations. We went up through the Sioux and across Canada, up around the Gaspé Peninsula, down through Niagara Falls and all the way home. And I said we went to Disneyland when Disneyland was just opening. We were in a one of the earliest campsites down in Disney World, not Disneyland. And we went out west also. We traveled out west. We did a lot of traveling with the family. We were fortunate with that.
Yeah, so switching gears.
Yep.
Could we talk about the 440th Airlift Council? And
Oh, yeah.
in that?
I was always interested in airplanes. When I was a little kid, probably 10 or 12 years old, my piano teacher, husband, was a pilot. And he was good friends with my folks and what have you. And so you wouldn't remember it, and 99% of the people would. There was an airport on the corner of on 60th and Brown Deer Road. It was a grass-field airport. And he said, Lyle, I want to take you up for an airplane ride. So I hopped in this Piper Cub, backseat of this Piper Cub, and we took off, and I got sicker than a dog. So I threw up all over the airplane. It was a terrible experience. He did this 2 or 3 times with me and finally said, forget it, I'm not going to take you up anymore. Well, as it turns out, I loved airplanes, and all during my Boy Scout days, I built an awful lot of model airplanes, had scrapbooks I wish I could find of all the airplanes at the time, the Second World War and all that. And then as time went on, a good friend of mine was involved with the 440th. 440th Community Council was a group of civilians, basically business people, who supported the 440th and whatever. And so the 440, we had monthly meetings, and 2 or 3 times, well, no, maybe twice a year, they would take a C-130, that's a transport plane that the 440th used, and they would put a skid of airline seats in it, and they would fly a bunch of business people to various air bases. We flew out to Kansas, where the B-1 bomber was, and each time you went, you went at the equivalent of a bird colonel as far as your ability to go and do things and see things. Went down to Barksdale Air Base down in Louisiana, and that's where the B-52s are kept. And they have the atomic bombs down there as well. And we were able to go up to the B-52s, and that's where the sign says, if you are not, how does it read? Anyway, the military police are authorized to shoot if you get in the way. Well, we could go in there, and we went through all kinds of different things. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had the opportunity to use a A-10 Warthog fighter bomber. That's the one with the Gatling gun in the front that just obliterates the enemy. In the full trainer, it's a full cockpit with a big screen out in front, and you literally take off. You fly around and you shoot a couple tanks and you come back and land. And that was one of the best experiences I ever had. Also other things, you went to shooting ranges, and I shot every kind of a weapon that the Army and Air Force uses in a range. And then they had a simulator where you could go through, and in one place you were in a shopping mall, and if it was a shoot or don't shoot situation, and it was all electronic, but it was really cool. So we had a number of those flights. Those were really interesting. In the meantime, I became a member of the board of directors of 440th, and I got a beautiful plaque and what have you for that. The 440th then was transferred down to, I think, Georgia or someplace, and so it's not at Mitchell Field anymore. The 128th refueling is over there, and some of the people that were with the 440th went over to the refuel. I went there a few times, but I didn't stay on with it, so
yeah,
that's my experience with the 440th.
Okay, so switching gears here, just going back to Freedom Village in Korea.
Yeah.
So, can you go over your experience with that? Just kind of the prisoners of war coming through and everything?
Yeah.
And any, relationships?
Yeah, as they came through, they had a full physical all the way around, from a dental check to hearts and the whole shebang. And then when they were done, they were in a series of tents, waiting for their uniforms to be delivered, which were custom made for each one of them. And I was sitting on a bunk with a gentleman one day, had been returned. Now, some of the guys that came back were in really bad shape. Others were in pretty good shape, depending on how long they'd been up there. So I'm sitting there, and the guy next to me, kind of sat up straight, and I said, "What's up?" He said, "See that guy over there?" He said, "If you give me a knife, I'll go slit his throat right now." I said, "Whoa." He apparently the guy had been a collaborator, and as it turns out, I found out later on that a number of people, they were flown from Freedom Village to a hospital ship down in Incheon, and then from Incheon they took the hospital ship home. I was told at some point in time that a number of people didn't make it home. Some of the guys didn't abide by the military rules of capture and what have you, and they collaborated, and some of the other guys didn't. That's enough to say, you get what I'm getting at. They didn't make it home.
Yeah. So when you say collaborator, what does that really entail?
Well, they cooperated with the enemy.
Oh, okay.
As opposed to.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right. So then, do you remember any stories that any of the prisoners of war would tell you?
Not really. But I had another interesting experience with one of them. I went on the flights.
Honor flight?
Honor flight. Thank you. Old age setting in. On the honor flight 2 years ago, and on the flight, I was able to sit. I knew the guys that were running the honor flight. A quick aside: the guy that was pretty much in charge of the honor flights was the son of the architect that designed my dad's house on 54th Street.
Wow.
53rd Street. Anyway, so I had a first-class seat right behind the cockpit, and sitting next to me was a fellow from New Berlin that had been a prisoner. And after we got talking a while, I said, "You know, I served you your first meal when you came back as a prisoner." And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah." He said, "And I didn't last long either." I said, "What do you mean?" Well, he was in tough shape. He said, "Yeah, that ice cream went in one end and it came out the other right away." What we were serving them back at the time was beef that had been cooked to really tender, mashed potatoes that were loaded with butter and peas, and they would fly in ice cream every couple of days for these guys. Well, those that had been captured recently could eat all of it. Some of them couldn't eat much of anything. Their stomachs had been shrunk so small. So that's one of the side stories.
Yeah. So with the prisoners of war, like you said earlier that you picked up some of the things they left. Could you cover some of those things that they left behind? Yeah.
Well, I had one of them left a bowl that had been hammered out of a artillery shell, which I think I showed you, and a spoon and some fans and some cigarettes and some other things along the way, just little trinket things that they didn't want to take home. So I picked them up and brought them home.
Yeah. So then, after the war, within your photography, were you doing any like major projects with that? Anything?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's after the war is when I was doing the wedding shots. After I got married, then I would do weddings on weekends, and then all week long I'd be gone from upstairs because I was processing all of this stuff. This was all done by hand with developing and printing and reprinting some of them a lot of times. It isn't like your digital stuff today where boom, you know. But anyway,
So,
So-
then, were you still involved with the Boy Scouts at all after
no,
this?
nope. I pretty much stayed out of the Boy Scouts. They came to me a number of times, but I had lost interest in that part of it. So
Yeah. So then you also said you were on the board of directors of the Wisconsin Savings and Loan League. What does
Yes.
that really entail?
that was the trade organization for all the savings and loans in the city at the time. Actually in the state. Yeah, I got to be president of that for a while, and that was just a trade organization. We'd have meetings regularly, and then we'd every spring and fall we'd have a trip out to maybe Phoenix or some nice city, San Francisco or whatever, and have a meeting out there.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's all we got.
is that it?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure here, guys. I appreciate the opportunity to spill out all my
Yeah,
stuff.
no, it's great.
So, okay.
Thanks.